In the dead of night, beneath a blanket of darkness, an explosion of dust and clattering metal breaks the eerie silence. Somewhere in a desolate, stone-walled fortress, a handful of men, driven by desperation, are about to make a break for it. They've been planning this moment for months, if not years. But this isn't some Hollywood fantasy. It's the untold story of one of the most daring escapes in history, an escape that shocked the world and became a legend. This wasn't just a desperate attempt to run from prison, it was a calculated, heart-pounding, life-or-death struggle for freedom. These men, many of them broken by years of captivity, used not only their minds but their sheer willpower to defy a system that had every tool at its disposal to crush any resistance. This is the story of the Great Escape, not the one you've seen on the silver screen, but the real escapes that made the world stand up and take notice. Take, for instance, the infamous escape from Stalag 13C, a German POW camp during World War II. In the harsh winter of 1943, a group of Allied prisoners hatched a plan that seemed impossible. The camp was surrounded by high walls, barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards. It had the feel of a fortress that couldn't possibly be breached. But this group wasn't just going to slip past guards or dig a tunnel. They were going to climb a bluff, a sheer rock face that, by all rights, should have been impassable. One man, a British officer by the name of Michael John Smith, had an idea that most would dismiss as lunacy. Instead of trying to dig out under the watchful eyes of the guards, he decided they'd scale the rock face and flee into the woods beyond. The plan was audacious, requiring not only physical strength but a deep understanding of the land, and an almost absurd amount of luck. Smith, a former mountain climber, led the charge. His confidence was contagious. Every prisoner who followed him knew they were facing more than just physical obstacles. They were facing death if they were caught. The night of the escape, when the prisoners started their climb, the tension was unbearable. The guards, as usual, were vigilant. But what the prisoners knew, what they had learned over the weeks of meticulous planning, was that the guards' routine was predictable. And it was in that predictability that the prisoners found their opening. Michael John Smith and his companions climbed the rock face, hand over hand, foot after foot, until they reached the top. The climb was grueling, so much so that one of the prisoners, an American named James Duffy, nearly lost his grip. But in that moment of near defeat, something extraordinary happened. The air seemed to thicken with resolve, as if the very force of their desperation was pulling them up, inch by inch. Every movement was a gamble. Every sound a risk. But somehow, they made it. However, the escape was far from over. They still had to navigate through miles of snow-covered woods with no clear path, no map, and no idea what lay ahead. As the prisoners pushed forward, the biting cold began to take its toll. But for every step of pain and fear, there was the growing exhilaration of freedom just beyond reach. It wasn't long before they encountered their first major obstacle, a German patrol, only a few yards away. The men froze. A moment of silence, thick with dread. The enemy soldiers were searching the area, unaware of the escapees right under their noses. The tension was suffocating. But then, by some miracle, the patrol moved on without noticing them. The men breathed again, but only for a moment. They had crossed one hurdle, but there were many more ahead. It was a game of cat and mouse. Every rustling leaf, every creaking branch, every crunch of snow underfoot felt like it could betray them. Yet they pressed on. For hours, they trekked through the unforgiving wilderness, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the prison. And then came the ultimate test of their endurance. A snowstorm, fierce and blinding, swept in out of nowhere. The men couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Their legs, exhausted from hours of running, began to buckle. And in that chaos, a twist of fate occurred. One of the prisoners, William Knight, broke through a hidden ice shelf and fell into freezing waters. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be so cold that your body stops responding, imagine that feeling. Knight's body began to shut down. He was frozen, disoriented, and about to lose consciousness. But the men around him weren't going to let him die there, in the wilderness, alone. They carried him, every step a battle between life and death, but refusing to give up. In the end, Knight survived, not because of some extraordinary physical feat, but because of the unbreakable bond of the men who refused to leave anyone behind. The group eventually made their way to neutral territory in Switzerland, where they were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But their story didn't end there. Word of their escape spread quickly. The Germans were furious, and they would go to any length to prevent future attempts. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling part of this tale. What it says about the lengths to which humans will go to escape oppression, even when the odds are overwhelmingly stacked against them. However, not all escapes were so successful. A chilling twist of fate befell another group of prisoners in the same war, this time in the infamous Colditz Castle, a high-security German prison that housed some of the most dangerous Allied prisoners. Colditz was thought to be impenetrable, an unsolvable riddle for escape artists. But one man, British Major Pat Reed, was determined to prove otherwise. Reed was a master of deception, and his plan revolved around misdirection. Instead of focusing on breaking out the usual way, through tunnels or climbing walls, Reed used the one thing the Germans never anticipated: their own arrogance. He knew that they would never believe someone could escape right under their noses, in plain sight. Reed's escape came down to a tiny detail. He managed to convince the guards that he was an official British visitor, not a prisoner at all. Through a clever ruse involving uniforms, false papers, and a bit of audacity, Reed walked straight out the front gate of Colditz. No tunnel, no rock climb, just sheer nerve. He would later say that the hardest part wasn't escaping the prison, it was convincing himself that he was allowed to leave. But the dark irony of the story? As Reed escaped, he left behind a friend, who was caught and executed. The guilt haunted him for the rest of his life. Escape was not without a cost, whether it was the risk of death or the betrayal of comrades. The truth is, every great escape tells a story not just of a prison, but of the human spirit itself. These stories aren't just about breaking out of physical cells. They're about breaking out of mental prisons, of pushing against the very forces that try to keep us confined. For the men who managed to escape, they didn't just defy their captors, they defied the odds, the system, and the very idea that their lives were controlled by anything but their own will. So, as we reflect on these daring escapes, perhaps there's a question we should all ask ourselves: what are the invisible prisons in our own lives? What invisible walls are we willing to break down, no matter the odds? The next time you hear a story of an escape, remember, it's never just about the freedom they gained, but the courage it took to even try.